Hello orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. In this video today, we're going to look at one of my cornu cervi hybrids. This one is a cross between cornu cervi and Seuss milk puff. This orchid has gone through a couple different growing methods, and eventually I decided that this one will do best based on my observation in the Moss+No Hole Method. So let's go back in time to take a look at how it has progressed during this particular flowering cycle. So mid-March 2020 was when I started to see this orchid elongating from its existing spike and starting to put out new buds. At that time though, I wasn't quite sure how many flowers it would get, because at first I was only seeing 2 to 3 buds, but then as the first 2 buds were starting to get bigger, all of a sudden the initial secondary spike, or I guess the elongated portion, just continued to grow even further. So I obviously had to, continue to feed it with a little bit more fertilizer, and thankfully this orchid is pretty hardy. Even when it was in bud and getting fertilizer, there's no bud blast or anything. This orchid originally was in water culture. When I first got it, I thought, I saw the roots being so thick and healthy. I put this orchid in full water culture, and then I scaled back to semi-water culture. It still didn't do well. It rotted pretty much all its roots, so I decided that I had to do something. So at the time I was experimenting with the Moss+No Hole Method. So this one was one of the candidates, and guess what, it actually really liked it. So I used an 8-ounce cup, if I remember correctly, and it responded with that method and continued to grow new roots. So then I transferred it into a 12-ounce cup after it had produced a little bit more roots. And then from there, it just took off, and really enjoyed the way that the moss is in relations to the cup as well as the air inside the container. And I think the key to this Moss+No Hole method is that the moss needs to be very fluffy. It cannot be tightly packed, and that way you are allowing enough moisture and air to create a perfect balance, or to create that humid condition inside the container for the roots to be able to grow even more. And in terms of care, this orchid receives 1/4 cup of water each time. In winter, I may selectively reduce the water amount to about 1/8 of a cup sometimes, but most of the time this orchid gets 1/4 cup, and the solution usually is already given fertilizer. So another 25% fertilizer diluted into the solution, and then the 1/4 cup of it is what this orchid would get typically. One thing interesting about this orchid is that it started to mature its second bud and third bud first, and the first bud actually just kind of stayed dormant until it opened its third flower, I believe. So for some reason the first bud just grew out first, but it just kind of stayed there and then waited for a while. I thought that bud wasn't gonna make it but it eventually did. So the first bud was the 4th to open. Kind of strange. I don't know if any of your orchid does that, but I've had some orchids that, that would bloom on the second bud, but then the first bud would then, quickly open. But this one, the first bud was the fourth to open. To me, that's kind of weird. This orchid unfortunately is not fragrant, but I think the color combination kind of makes up for it. It's a kind of red that's not completely opaque, so you can still see light through it, and you can see the veining on the flower. But when you remove the light source, the flower is actually looking quite dark. But the way that the red in the background and then having that white lip in the front, creates a very, very interesting high color contrast. And here you can also see in front of the dark background, you get to see the red as well as the white even more distinctively. This orchid in Chinese also has a nickname, and it's called Antler's orchid. And I think that's because the flower spikes of cornu cervi are flatter, and they look like antlers of animals, like animal antlers. So that's just something I found interesting when I was traveling in Asia. Went back to Taiwan and visited a couple friends, and we went to the flower market, and on many signs they called this the antler orchid. And some people ask me whether this kind of orchid or cornu cervi hybrids, whether they are finicky or hard to handle, hard to care for. And the answer is no. I found my cornu cervi hybrids to be extremely hardy, but they do appreciate drier condition. Some orchids are more thirsty, but these, at least the ones that I have in my collection, they're actually more drought tolerant, and I would even say they prefer to be on the drier side, because when I reduce the amount of water, they actually somehow look better. The roots are really thick, but that doesn't mean that they actually like water for some reason. Now, you can see that some aerial roots hanging out in the background, and that's actually not true aerial roots. Those are the long roots that have already grown into the cup and then coming back out of the cup. So I have a couple of decisions I have to make with this orchid, and that is, after the blooms are done this year, do I want to repot this orchid, or should I just let it be? Because, if you look at the video here, it has pretty good root system inside the cup, circling, and it's, I think it's just loving it. So in a way, I kind of feel like I shouldn't bother. I shouldn't, try to do anything with it. I mean, if it's not broken, why fix it, right? So I do have to do a little bit of soul searching, because if I want to repot it, yes, I can put the aerial roots back into the container, but what if I set this orchid back for some reason? Is that something worth doing? And it's also working on a new leaf. I noticed that this orchid is really, really liking, well, obviously bright location and then drier condition. Other than that, quarter strength fertilizer within quarter cup of water, and that's it. And every week I gave it the same thing, except at the end of the month I would soak it really well with just pure water. I'll fill up the water until just below the tip of the stem and let it hang out, let it soak for a couple hours, and then I would tilt the cup to let the water flow out, and then obviously it will drip, but be patient, let it drip until there's no more dripping. Then that's when you can tell that it's done. After the soaking, it's still pretty wet, and usually more wet than normal, so I will make sure that my environment is well ventilated, and sometimes I would even turn on the fan just for these orchids to be able to dry on a faster pace. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!